Fantastic. Well, good afternoon. I'm Melissa Lazaro, Director of Marketing, and so glad that you've joined us today to learn about the science of reading in your assessment portfolio. Today's webinar is brought to you by MindPrint Learning. MindPrint Learning is the only K-12 solution that uses objective cognitive data to teach students how they learn best and provide the strategies personalized to students' learning strengths and needs. Our speaker today is Dr. Greg King. Most recently, Greg worked at NWEA as a research scientist and is one of their leaders in thinking about how to innovate and change standardized assessments. Greg has over 10 years experience in education research and policy analysis. He's passionate about collaborating to find and solve complex and systematic problems in education. Greg is presented to the Senior Department of Education at the White House to staff members and is continuously leading teams to evaluate innovative solutions using agile methods. So we are just so thankful that Greg is a part of the MindPrint Learning team, and he's going to discuss with you today the science of learning in your assessment portfolio. We made this a meeting format versus a webinar because we want you to be able to engage today. So if you have questions, you can put those in the chat, and we'll have a Q&A time at the end. I also wanted to let you know that Greg is going to be featured in our blog next week. And so we'd love for you to follow our blog. If you're not following us on social media already, please do so. And I'll give you a chance to introduce you to our Pennsylvania team at the end of this webinar as well. And we'll have their contact information. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Greg King.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Melissa. I am incredibly excited to be speaking with you all today and to be a part of the MindPrint team. This is my first webinar, so thank you for your grace as well. Feel free to come off mute and talk about what we're discussing, ask questions. I'm just excited to be part of the conversation, really excited to engage you all in the science of learning. And part of this is personal for me too, because I joined MindPrint because of my work with assessment. So I'm going to start off with a little bit about me so that you know who you're speaking with and have some sense of community and get a sense of who I am and the approach that I'll take to talking about these things. So let's see if I can get my screen to change. There we go. So my background, kind of my why I joined MindPrint is I kept asking why we're not seeing more growth. And the more that I listened to teachers, to district superintendents, to principals, and to students, the more that I became convinced that we're missing a crucial element in our classrooms. And so that ties back to my entire journey. So this is as with many of us, my journey into research is a lot of squiggly lines and backtracking and figuring out what we can do and what's going on. And so I started off I didn't start off going to college. I'll be completely transparent about that. I actually went and worked full time right out of high school. I worked in the back room of a Marriott setting up for conferences and slowly learned that, hey, maybe I should go to college through a variety of things. And so pursued college. And as I got into college and started to study, I went to a regional public university. It was the only university I knew of. The reason I attended is I had read in a newspaper the night before I applied that they had decided that they were going to do a 4-year tuition guarantee. And since I was paying for it on my own, I said, well, if it's going to cost the same for all 4 years, I should go there. I didn't even know of any other schools I could apply to. So I just threw my name in and they called me up and said, hey, you should apply for a scholarship and do FAFSA. And I was like, what's that? So I had this very non-traditional experience with going into college. And as I started to go through the years of education, I started to wonder, where are the people like me? Where are people that come from a background where college wasn't necessarily always talked about, or careers where you exist in communities where careers are limited to maybe 4 or 5 things that all your friends do, your parents do, parents of your friends do, and there's not a whole lot of variety that you're exposed to. And where are those people? So I asked, why are there not more opportunities? And so I went into higher education and said, well, clearly we need to work on access issues in higher education. And as I started working on access issues in higher education, I realized, well, really, we need to work on K-12 assessments that start giving students narratives that they think about and start guiding their pathways in middle school. So I applied to work for NWEA and said, how can I work on assessments where we can better create access and opportunity for students to go to school or to find the right careers and to move forward in those spaces. So NWA gave me an amazing opportunity. I was a research scientist there and really studying the assessment, said, wow, these are really solid assessments. They measure what they say they're measuring. However, why aren't we seeing more growth with all students? If they're measuring so precisely and the models are correct, why are we not seeing more growth? Why are we not seeing changes in how students bring their talents to this table? How come we're still not unlocking student brilliance? And so I said, well, I think it's about how students learn. We're only assessing one in one way. It's very unidimensional, right? It's like one thing. If you're good at reading it and you're good at remembering it, you're going to do well on that assessment, but that doesn't necessarily unlock what students know. So while at NWA, I got asked, hey, do you want to build different assessments that would actually do that? And started doing that, and then realized, well, MindPrint's here. Why don't I go do that? Because I think this is it. The cognitive piece of how students learn is so valuable in assessments and in how we understand and teach students that we need to move in that direction. That I really want to unlock that box. So I kept, my career is just basically that swirl of saying, why is this not working? Why is this not working? Why is this not working? And landing in cognitive ability space and saying, why aren't we using this more? And as I've done my homework on this, I should mention that this is our agenda. So I dove right into talking about these things, but my goal for this is really to have a conversation, help understand the impact of cognitive learning and cognitive skills and all learning, to recognize some of the research that this isn't something that we're just pulling out or anybody's pulling out and plopping down on a table and saying, well, let's do this, that there's actually some really good research behind it. And then to articulate the impact that we can have. So those are kind of my goals. But as I was saying, the purpose of the assessment of where we are and why this isn't working is research. Really, we're the problems. I'm the problem with why we haven't done this. And there's a great paper that was written by the folks that I have cited right here, where they basically say one of the problems with cognitive abilities that we're not hearing about is that researchers don't necessarily always talk in accessible language to educators. And then when they do, it's they don't have the experience of being in a classroom with students. And so it's not always understanding of how there's missed language, right? So we talk in these overly complex terms, and you can see this is the way that the research papers describe the science of learning. It's super academic, it's ivory tower, and it doesn't necessarily get at how we apply this into the classroom. And so that's kind of the conversation that we want to have. So one of the things I was really excited about when I joined MindPrint is we've moved from that collegiate space into taking that science of learning model and saying it's about these three things: cognitive data, academic data, and social emotional data. And we know that these three things matter. The science talks about this a lot in terms of you can have 2 out of 3, but if you don't have all 3, then students aren't going to be grasping every piece. It's like levers, right? Sometimes some students are going to be weighed in one area. They're going to be good with verbal reasoning or good with some cognitive skills and be able to pull that lever, and they're going to be just fine. But we know that the power of enjoying what you learn, and as teachers, I'm sure you see that. I mean, you can probably give me examples of when students get excited about what they're learning, how much more they remember and grasp those things. And cognitively, right, brain-wise, we know that That's because it increases the ability of synaptic connections between our brain, between parts of our brain, so that they actually stay with us. It creates the pipelines, the way that we learn. It creates those mental models that students can hold on to and then access later with positive feelings and with the ability to know that they can understand those things. So so right there, we just hit all three things, right? Like cognitive abilities, social emotional learning, and academic data. So it's going to show up on academic data. And so the way I look at this is really all we're talking about when we talk about the science of learning, and all the research papers really boil down to whole human instruction and whole human learning. That, and I think, you know, we could take a pause anytime and kind of talk about this if you want to. Anybody feel free to come off mute and have a conversation about this. But I think I teach on the college level. I teach and I teach students that oftentimes come in not college ready. So students that have uh, who have had academic difficulties growing up. They're reading maybe at a third grade level as adults, or maybe they're doing math at lower levels. They haven't reached algebraic equations, for instance, in math. And so when we talk about these things, it's about the whole human. They feel frustrated because they're not at a level that other adults are, and they feel like less than, which causes them to say, well, I can't do this, so I don't even want to try, which makes it harder for those brain functions to really grab a hold and create those synaptic connections that will embed knowledge at a level where they could just recall on memory, which impacts their working memory, which impacts all these other things that we know happen. And the power of putting that together is something that we haven't unlocked in education. And part of it's because we lack information on it. So this is where we kind of get at what each one of these kind of define, right? For us, standardized tests, class test grades. I think if we just think about that for a minute, we know that we could be the best teacher in the world. And I think Susan, who's on this call, has this great example of talking about where she's like planned out amazing lessons. And I've done the same with the students I teach. Like, you know, you've planned an amazing lesson, you know it's powerful. And then like 3 weeks later, you go talk to your students and they don't remember anything you said. And it's so frustrating because they're like, I spent time planning that out. I know that I taught this. I know it was good. But it's just missing some of the mark on where what students need to be taught, with the way that they need to learn, with how their brain is functioning, with how they're making those synaptic connections. Or it could be that they lack some self-awareness or self-management, engagement, motivation. They may have so many things going on in their lives. And I think working with some of the at-risk students that I work with that come into the post-secondary space at community colleges, so many things going on that this is an also and that's the really hard part. I mean, my story, I was that kid for many of you. I grew up in foster care, which means I was like in the back of the class the entire education, sitting there not listening, kind of had life stuff going on that I need to focus on. And so I was never really present in the classroom. I had very little self-management, engagement, or motivation. And so how do we change those things to help students become engaged? And I think that's where we can start talking about the cognitive abilities piece, right? Of that complex reasoning, helping with those memory, the executive functions and processing. And that's what the science of learning, kind of combining all that, puts together a complete picture of the human so that we can walk forward. I'm going to pause there for a sec, because I've been talking for now, like, what, 15 minutes? What kind of questions do you have? What do you think? Does this resonate? What do you want to know more about or dive into?
I'll just comment that I saw some hearts floating around while you were speaking, Greg. So I think this is really resonating with people. Any sort of questions before he dives more into the content today? All right. I think this all makes sense. You've done a beautiful job of making something really complicated simple to understand and absorb, and easily process and apply. So thanks.
All right, I'm excited then. We'll continue on. So let's get to the kind of part of the science that I really think is important, and this is the practical side of my science background, of the research background, is that, so if all of these things are true, if we know that this combination, and we kind of have the research that this makes sense, why is it not more talked about? Why are we not using information that gives us the full breadth of our students? And some of that is that we have a small percentage of data. As teachers, as educators, we are overwhelmed with information. I read there's this organization called EdTech Evidence Exchange, and they pointed out that that nearly 60 to 70% of the technology that districts buy goes unused in the classroom because there's just no time to keep it up, right? There's tomorrow my daughter's in first grade. Tomorrow we have teacher in service. So teachers are going through another professional development. Again, it's this consistent kind of drumbeat of professional development, new tool, professional development, new tool, professional development, new tool. And it's hard to keep up on that. So we have tons of data on academic content, right? Like we do testing, we do, depending on we do formative, interim, summative testing. We have that because that's oftentimes what we use as an outcome variable, right? That's the thing that we're measuring our students by. Are you proficient in this? Have you met this standard? Do you know these specific topics? Can you regurgitate that back to me? And so we also know that we have behavioral issues, that if there are things going, especially in the post-COVID, as students have returned to the classroom, we know that the emotional disruption that happened during COVID is hard on our students. We have to learn that. So we have gone out and got data on those things. But what we haven't done is address the cognitive issues and thinking about our cognitive abilities. And we don't have data on that. And the problem with that is that when you look at the research, cognitive skills account for 50% of the academic variance in our students' lives. So how they learn accounts for an outsized proportion of what we want to get them to, right? Like we're trying to get them to learn these materials and these lifelong skills and become lifelong learners and have these 21st century, now I think 22nd century skills, right? We know that when they're out, even in third grade, second grade, kindergarten, we know that in the next 12 years, there's so much change happening that we have to prepare them for jobs that don't exist yet. And that we don't even know. I can't even imagine what they're going to be yet. And yet we're missing the thing that accounts for 50% of the variability in our scores. And so this to me is part of my passion enjoying MindPrint, because this is the biggest piece of, if we can figure out this, I think we're going to supercharge growth. I think we're going to see it in other areas, but we haven't got to this part yet. And so that is kind of the research behind these things. And this is kind of going back through the idea where this sits of the, we have academic knowledge, from curriculum and teaching training and depth of knowledge work that we all do, as educators. We have understand relationships, motivation, mindset, mental health. We know these things, but we don't know with data. I think if I gave you a definition of complex reasoning, which I will do, I will put the I will drink the rest of my coffee. That you all know exactly what I'm talking about, that you can identify students that struggle with complex reasoning, or you can identify students that struggle with memory processing. You can identify students that struggle with executive functioning. These things exist in your classroom, but yet we don't have data that supports how to group students or how to move students into differentiation that is not just academic based. And so that's something that I think that is pretty powerful with what we're talking about, is getting to those levels. So let's talk about what those mean. But first, I'm going to pause there. How are we on time? We good on time?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got about 20 more minutes, and then we can open up to questions.
Are there any questions about that first portion?
Yeah, I mean, the question is like, do we really know, or is there some sort of implicit bias or explicit bias that's playing into our perceptions of students that are struggling with these things? If we don't have the data, do we really know? Right.
Yeah,
And
I
so
think
how
that's
do we get that data then, I think, is
yeah,
where we're leading. But yeah.
love that. Yes. So we can say, like I just said, we could probably say, I know that this student is struggling with executive function, but I don't know how to understand where to go with helping them, right? And that's where we can kind of get into what do we need to know so that we can get our students where we want them to be. And part of that is the understanding, right? So these are the learning pyramid. These are the cognitive skills that MindPrint assesses. And they go through their 10 distinct, I think there's 9 here, but there's one other one that's not included in this list. That's but these are the things that we can say, hey, if you take these things, we can identify where your strengths are and where the areas that we need to scaffold. So I think about this pyramid similar to a tree. If we understand these areas, we can start scaffolding strategies and supports for students in areas where they have weaker ability. And by doing that, we start to level that playing field and create opportunities for more students to really experience growth or understand what makes them tick so they can lean into those strengths better too, right? So if I know that I took this myself and I have terrible handwriting. My processing speed, I just don't, I listen and then I just can't write fast enough to keep up. So I just skip it all together. And if you looked at my handwriting for notes, I never took notes in school because I was always behind. I was always the one kid that was like, I'm not gonna take. It doesn't even matter if I take notes because I can't read them. I can't understand what I just said, what just happened. So I'm just gonna rely on my memory. And luckily, my working memory is really strong, so I can remember most things. So I was able to rely on that strength when my weakness was something that if I didn't have that strength would have been completely detrimental to me in school. So if a teacher knew that, they could have helped me with my handwriting or ways to strategize slowing down, maybe give me graph paper so I can actually write in a straight line on something, or helping me to just slow down to take notes so that they gave space before the next conversation so that I had time to catch up, right? And things like that, they could have created those strategies to help scaffold that, which would have allowed me to have time to read, to process, to take the notes. We can, by knowing this data, we can actually provide better. I didn't remove the things. We can actually provide better MTSS supports. And this is where I'm going with the learning pyramid. This kind of maps nicely, this to this maps very nicely together when we think about how we create those supports. So if we know that we have these learning, kind of these cognitive abilities that students need to have and that are impactful to our education, then we can put them into our ability to understand how we create the supports that we need for our classroom. And this is kind of the ability for us to say, okay, we know that tier 1, how can I support core instruction with understanding cognitive abilities that align to other areas? Tier 2, I need to know how to provide strategies directly to students that will help them with their specific areas of cognitive abilities they're either strong in or not strong in, and provide those scaffolding areas so that I can understand how to work with those students. And when we do that, we ease the cognitive load that students are experiencing, right? Like that's the whole goal with this. I think we can all agree is is if students are weighing down by trying to catch up with something, or they don't quite understand, we're not understanding where or teaching to their cognitive strengths, then they have additional cognitive load. Their brains are working harder trying to remember this information, trying to create those connections to remember it, those pipelines, those highways of information that we all create in our minds. Their brains are working harder to do that. And so if we can figure that out, we can ease that cognitive load. We can increase their motivation and engagement by doing that, because we know, I have a first grader, right? Like, we know that when kids are learning a lot, they're exhausted. And they're exhausted because our brains are literally growing. We're making new connections, we're processing new grooves in our brain. And so our kids are tired. So if we reduce that cognitive load, make those pathways easier to happen, we're actually creating targeted intervention that works, because we're making it easier for that pathway to be created, those memories to be made, those abilities to be kind of brought forth. And then there's intensive support that we can also get into that, or is one-on-one. The other piece that I am really passionate about within this is underlying cognitive skills is student ownership. This is another piece, I think, as a researcher with NWA, one of the things I would always talk about is there's kind of a pathway where in our lower grades, right, it's really family engagement matters a lot. And so it's parents are owning kids' data, teachers are owning kids' data, kids aren't necessarily owning their own data. But as you get into middle school, kids start creating their narratives for who they are. And now they want access to that data and ownership of the data. So how do we consistently give students the ability to know themselves better, so they know what works for them, so that you as a teacher aren't always having to say, here's what works for you, but you can lead a student to say, here's what works for me. And by doing that, again, now you're increasing that motivation, now you're increasing reducing that cognitive load, increasing engagement, and giving self-ownership over these things.
And
And
I
so
would think,
that's
Greg, if I could chime in here,
yeah.
I would think that then that would create these sort of organic conversations that would happen amongst students of, oh yeah, I have to use picture flashcards too. Just writing the words down doesn't help me. Or, gosh, I understood everything the teacher said, but if I don't write it down because I have bad verbal memory, I'm not gonna be able to, do well on the test. So,
Exactly.
understanding who you are as a learner and then having those strategies is absolutely critical. I mean, I would just think a lot of us that are here that are educators, we kind of figured it out on our own, or we had some really amazing teacher that had insight into who we are and how we learned and gave us those strategies that we needed to succeed. But most of us probably just figured it out by trial and error, right? But there's a lot of kids out there that, don't have that access. So I think you're really speaking to the student story as well as to the educator story, which is really important and powerful. So thanks
Yeah.
for that, Greg.
I think about, I have some close friends and family members that have dyslexia. And for the longest time, I mean, and I was going to school, elementary school in the 80s and 90s, right? So, excuse me. And so we didn't have any thoughts about this. And so my brother grew up believing that he couldn't read. He never read a single book until high school, because he grew up believing he couldn't read when he had dyslexia. And things like this work allows our students to say, no, I can do this. I need to do it in this way. I need help in these ways. And if we can learn that and give our students access to the resources that they need in the way that they learn, now we're speaking to the ability to close gaps and to create growth and learn beyond what we currently see in our trends. We've seen, our NAEP scores keep going down, right? I think that part of that is because we're trying to focus so much on just what do you know, and we've removed the focus from how do we learn. And if we could start returning back to that foundation, I think we're going to have far better outcomes over time.
Yeah. I think of
Greg,
an
this is
educational
Barb.
Oh, go ahead.
I would just like to add one other thing. I think also you're talking about, the access issue. I also think it's an equity issue, because you showed that chart before where really only schools and districts really only have this information for less than 10% of their population, which means, and those are most of the kids that are referred on for special ed or for gifted. So I think that we really believe that this is an equity issue, that all kids have the right to understand how they learn. You know, it's like, okay, that 10% has it, but what about the rest of the 90% to address all of the important issues that you're talking about?
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. I really appreciate that and wholeheartedly agree. And in fact, one of the things I want to point out with this is that the thing that I am, when it comes to equity, is a lack of comparison, right? So for students to really buy into these things, it's really important that they don't feel like they are less than, that we're not putting them on a scale in front of them and saying, you're at the 2nd percentile and you're at the 99th percentile, which we do with our achievement tests. So the way that we approach the tier 1 instruction piece is to give students a report that shows where they're at without a ranking. So this is an example of a student kind of profile where we're showing where students are at without a ranking and how they go through learning the strategies that are best for their cognitive skills, and kind of showing them, hey, here's something that you can do. And the strategies are all available. I'll flash on that. And then they also get so here's some of the strategies that they actually can get is stronger verbal memory, stronger visual reasoning, pause to take feedback, right? Like that's the one for me of how do you slow down for a minute so that we can get to where we need to go, right? If you're going too fast. And you see me do it here, right? That's part of the reason I asked, what are the questions? Because I get going, I'm like a train. I just going down the tracks fast. And sometimes we need to pause to make sure everyone's with us, that we're bringing everyone
on that point, Greg. I think Ms. Jerry Johnson has a question.
Thanks so much. Just in addition, I was just going to add on to the last comment. So at that tier 3, where there's that 10%, you know, I do agree that there is an equity issue, but even amongst those 10%, do they understand how they learn?
That's
you
right.
know, there's this side that suggests that they know, but in many cases, they've never been told, they've never been given the strategies to process what they're learning. They've never been given, because there's so much emphasis on the academic data.
That's right.
So much, and so they're missing out on what areas they are actually strongest in and how that they can maximize their learning experiences.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with Jerry 100%. I mean, we focus so much on the academic remediation, but we're not focusing. There needs to be a balance there, right? On how are you learning? How are you accessing that information and processing that and remembering that and applying that? And so that balance there of remediating the academic, but also the cognitive skills and really empowering those kids. I think, I mean, we'll get to this in a minute, but obviously you're seeing this is the MindPrint learning solution that offers these profiles, but I can't tell you how many times we hear kids say to their teachers, this is the first time I've heard, I mean, it makes me cry. This is the first time I've heard I have a strength.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the part that, you know, even going further, knowing, hey, here are for students as you go in, this is another report, and you can see, here are the things, here are the strengths you have, here's some things to support, right? We're not saying it's a weakness. Because again, if we think about this from a research perspective, weaknesses are gonna go into that social emotional category of saying, okay, so I have a weakness. I'm not good at this. It feeds into that motivation. Why try? And the whole purpose of the science of learning is to treat these students like whole humans, where we look at and say, we all have skills to support. We all have things that we are really strong in and things that we need to scaffold in strategies so that we can make that work. And we know that, let's be honest about that, but that's not bad. That's not you're not a bad learner, which I think we start only focusing on the academic side, we get into, I am a bad student because I score poorly. Therefore, I will never be anything but a bad student. And that's a really dangerous way for us to look at education. And so this brings us back to that. How do we move forward by showing students, let's scaffold here and work with each other on these areas. These are the strategies, and there's actually a QR code on here where you can go and look at all the strategies online. But I just want to point that out, that there are something like 400 strategies out there to help students scaffold and to learn. And these are just really nice ways for us to kind of support the science piece with the practical application of science. Because again, going back to the very beginning of this, the whole point is that if we just exist in a vacuum, if we know that cognitive abilities matter, we have no way of accessing them, no way to collect data on them, then we're not doing any good. And so the whole purpose is to give it practical application and get it out there so that students can begin using that data and that material for themselves. And then there's also school and class trends that I wanted to show, that you can aggregate up to your class level and differentiate group, but that's not my role. But so I'm just leaving that, saying that exists. I want to get to where my vision with this is that if we can move, I think academic assessments are important for what they are. It is important that we understand what our students know, and it is important that those are connected to the student's cognitive abilities so that we can contextualize what a student knows and help create growth. The purpose of academic assessment shouldn't be that we just a one-time stamp a student knows they're ready to go to the next grade or they're ready to go to the next unit. The purpose is for us to really help students understand knowledge and learn how to gain that knowledge in the future, right? It's not just a one and done purpose. It's this connected growth model that we need to have. And I think that the academic cognitive assessments integrated with achievement data is getting at that whole student. It's helping us understand, how do I help you learn so that you can showcase your brilliance, so that you can go out there and say, this is what I know and this is how I know it. And if we get to those places, I think we're going to see our achievement scores start climbing over time. It may take some time to get there, but we're going to see that happen as students get to the place where, like, this is how I need to learn this information. And these are the strategies I have, so that even if my achievement test looks like this and isn't geared toward my strength, I have strategies to go out there and showcase that, what I've learned on that style of achievement test. So this is my dream. Eventually, my dream would be to do away with end of year assessments entirely and embed them into the full year, because it doesn't, end of year doesn't give us as instructors any information that we can use in the classroom. So I'd just love it if it was naturally embedded throughout the year. But for right now, this is the model, and the idea that we can integrate cognitive assessments within that is really important. And then finally, I've moved a little bit, but I'm still in this mix of asking why and learning. So as I said, this is my first webinar with MindPrint, and I love what I'm seeing, and the research behind it is really important. And my goal is to continue to develop research that connects these things together so that we can take that out and give that to students, give that to parents, district administrators, leaders, whomever asks, in the way that they need it, right? So not just writing academic papers, but putting out there things that help us in our different cognitive abilities, and making sure that we're meeting the needs of our education system and our students where they're at today. So that's our conversation. That's my part of the conversation. I would love some more conversation about different things and kind of just have a discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Greg. Appreciate it. Well, this
I'd
is your
like
time.
to share,
Yeah,
if
thanks,
possible. I just wanted to share a success story from MindPrint for everybody who's listening. I think having a student understand what they need and understand where their strengths and weaknesses are, and I've seen this personally, it makes all the difference, because it allows them to go ahead and make a plan for themselves that draws on those strengths. So just being able to see a student that I know go through not understanding why there were so many difficulties, to taking the MindPrint test, to understanding that there was some executive functioning, to using some strategies, to, applying and getting into college, and, knowing that they need to plan their time in a different way. Just having the information has helped to lead to small successes that, eventually will lead to life successes. So I just wanted to share that because it works, and the information is so important and valid.
Thank you, Dana. Just for context, because this is a Pennsylvania focused meeting today. Can you just share like your role and what school district you're in?
I'm from Ridley School District in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, and I am the Director of Staff and Program Development here.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing. Anyone else have any questions?
So Jamie mentioned impact cognitive. I'm just going to read. Jamie, do you want to come off mute, or you want me to read this out loud?
Yeah, no, you could just summarize it. You mentioned cognitive load, or the theory a couple times, and looking at the MindPrint profile when we're talking with teachers and students and being mindful. When you talked about your handwriting story, I thought about kind of those pieces, and certainly how we're using technology in the classrooms right now, and the primary tasks versus secondary tasks. And I'm just thinking about in context with the MindPrint learning profile in students and teachers, and want to know your thoughts on that.
Sure. I think it's a lot. So I'm going to take a second to think through this. And I think I think the power of students knowing what going back to Dana's story, the power of students knowing what they need to know. They're not going to be thinking about, oh, my cognitive load is heavy, right? But they're thinking, I'm really tired. I mean, I remember, so I was not, going back to the math thing, I was not a math person. I was told I'm not a math person, and I became a quantitative research scientist. So clearly I was a math person. I just didn't know how to do math, because every time I sat in a desk to do math, I was exhausted. And so I didn't know what cognitive load was. I just knew that every time I sat down in that classroom and the teacher started talking to me about math, I got tired. My eyes glazed over. I thought about other things. I was not there to do the homework or the lessons. And so I think that the way that we process information, if we can give students that knowledge about processing information, then they may not say, well, the cognitive load of this is heavy, because that's very academic, scientific language, but they're going to say, I'm less tired when I do it this way. I'm more energized, or I can at least make it through this class engaged. And maybe that's just the baseline that we need to start with, is I am engaged in learning when I do it this way, or when you provide me with these things. And maybe that's some trial and error that we need to test. But if we have their data, then our trial and error becomes a shorter window where it's manageable in a classroom, right? We're not just throwing everything and seeing what works. We're throwing specific things at students that are matched with their cognitive ability that we have information on. So I think about going back to that grouping idea of the grouping classroom differentiation that I showed is oftentimes what I see in classroom is differentiation based on achievement levels. But if we differentiate based on learning style or cognitive abilities, then our students might have more engagement, because you're grouping in ways that make sense to their learning ability. So and you're mixing by achievement levels that way too, where our lowest achieving students can actually start learning with and alongside the higher achieving students in ways that they're all understanding and seeing that they are at those levels, that they can do those things. And that's a powerful, powerful memory for them that again goes back to that reducing the cognitive load. So that's kind of how I think about it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it was just more, as you were talking, I thought about it differently than I had in the past. So
okay. that's part of the goal, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what I think. I think a lot about how we can put students together in ways that they learn. So I go back to, in community college was when I took my first statistics class and I sat down, and I'd scored poorly in math my entire life. And I sat down in statistics class, and I had a teacher that said, group something together and give me a chart. First thing, and I was like, here's this chart. And she said, you're good at statistics. This is what it is. It's telling stories with data. And I was like, oh, and I got a straight A in that class, and then went on to get straight A's in every other math class I took after that point. And that's the power of figuring out how we learn and grouping together even differently than we think about. So I that's something that I always go back to as well.
I know, I think Jerry had another question. And
Oh, yeah.
before we jump to Jerry, I just want to make it clear, just because I feel like I'm not doing my job if I don't bring this up. But, MindPrint makes it really easy in that we integrate with all that achievement data. So you can see, maybe I'm just going to use colors. They're in the yellow in this particular area of math, but their cognitive ability, their MindPrint score is saying here. So you're seeing where that potential is for each student. Are they meeting their potential, or could they exceed their potential? And so, just really simple, clear reports that show that I think makes it nice as a parent tool, communication tool, but also I think for educators as well. Jerry, what was your question?
So I love Jamie's question. And Dr. Greg, you made reference to this. Considering that we are preparing students for jobs that have not yet been created, we have to be, as educators, mindful of the technology components. So and this is not really a question, it's just kind of just throwing this idea out there. Currently, I'm teaching students with special needs, and I utilize voice typing, right? And this empowers them. So focusing on that social emotional learning component, this boosts their confidence, and it eliminates the cognitive load. But when they see the PSSA, they're not allowed to use voice typing. So hopefully, and now going back to that whole argument of standardized testing, what standardized testing looks like moving forward post-COVID needs to look very different than what it looked like before COVID, So I just kind of wanted to mention that. So thank you for your comment, Jamie. And this has been wonderful. So thank you.
Love to hear that. And I 100% agree with you. One of the things that I was working on before I came to MindPrint is like the idea that how do we move from asking a question about making a wall that could withstand hurricane force winds to three-dimensionally designing a building that could withstand hurricane force winds and having it be tested in a computer, right? That tells us more. It gives the students, and it is accessible to a wider range of students. I can say that that's what people are working to build so that we can move in that direction, and even bigger game development companies like Roblox is moving in this space and things like that. So we're seeing that movement, and I think keep saying that, keep talking about that, because I think the more that educators talk about that, the more that we can push that system to change.
I'm sort of curious, for those that aren't currently using MindPrint, and I know that there's several on this call, what do you think would be some of the barriers that might prevent a school from using this data? Or, from what approach would you take for implementation, do you think?
I see that Jerry put in the chat cost.
Okay. Anything else?
I think that it's important to follow through from our experience with the professional development so that the teachers understand how to interpret the data, and so that they can help their students to interpret the data as well.
Okay, that's good.
From a building leader standpoint, I could tell you that this is definitely not a sprint and more of a marathon, in the sense that you have to really think through, like, not just a 1-year plan, but 3 years where you'd like to see, because although it's super simple and obviously you're just overloaded with data and it's meaningful data, it's just how do what Dana was saying about PD and getting your teachers and everyone on board and making sure that you're using succinct language so that everyone's on the same page.
And I would also add, though, that also it's an incredible tool for parents, you know, because I think then it creates common language for parents, and what parent on this planet doesn't want to know how to help their kids at home? So that it's the best parent conference tool and a communication tool, engagement tool, I think, with families and connecting them to schools and really creating a consistent approach as well.
And let's not leave out the students themselves. Having the conversations with students and letting them take ownership of their own learning is probably what I've seen as the most powerful piece that goes with this.
And Leanne, can you tell us your role? I see the Ridley logo in the back, but could you share?
I'm the superintendent at Ridley School District.
Thank you. Just for context for everybody else that's on the call, I appreciate it. I know we have a few Ridley folks on here. I'll share that Greg is going to be featured in our blog next week. So we'd love for you to follow our blog, follow us on social media. If you're ever interested in contributing to some video content, if you're a current customer of ours, we'd love to have your voice and share it with the world. So we thank you for all that you do as educators and leaders in helping kids each and every day. We know what a sacrifice it is.